Imagine two 30-year-old men.
Okay.
They grew up in the exact same country, they fled the exact same war, and today they live on the exact same street in Germany.
Right, so practically identical backgrounds.
Exactly. They both rely on state welfare, and they both have, well, they have exactly $0 in their bank accounts.
That is a very stark picture.
It is, right. But here's the thing. If you ask the first man about his life, he considers himself a hopeless, absolute failure, like completely trapped by his circumstances.
Yeah, which makes sense from the outside looking in.
But if you ask the second man, he will tell you he considers himself freer and, more optimistic than he has ever been in his entire life.
It is a profound contradiction, really. And I think it perfectly illustrates the absolute failure of the external labels we apply to people.
Right.
We kind of just assume we can measure human experience with a clipboard and a checklist.
Nah.
But reality is infinitely more complex than that.
Welcome to ofEmpowerMigra. Here, it's all about scientific studies on migration explained simply.
Glad to be here for this one.
So I want to start by asking you a question, and it's the core of our deep dive today. What does it actually mean to live a precarious life? And perhaps more importantly, who gets to decide that?
That is such a fundamental question. And honestly, it is the exact backdrop we need for this discussion.
Because we hear that word all the time.
Oh, constantly. You hear precarious thrown around in the media, in politics, in everyday conversation. And it is almost always treated as an objective, measurable fact.
Like a math problem.
Exactly like a mathematical equation. If you have a certain income level plus a certain housing situation, that just equals precarious.
Right.
But today, we're going to look at the invisible layers of that definition, because there is so much more beneath the surface.
We really need to talk about the narratives that surround refugees today, because if you listen to the public debate, and really listen, you generally hear two incredibly loud, incredibly simplified extremes.
Yes, the discourse is very polarized.
Right. On one hand, you have this view that says refugees who come here just live off the state and have it incredibly easy.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the exact opposite view, the one that says they are all helpless victims, completely trapped in terrible situations.
Yeah, incapable of agency.
Exactly, completely passive.
It sounds so clear-cut when you put it like that. You just put people in one box or the other. But is reality ever really that simple?
Never.
Right. When you actually look at the human experience, these extreme categorizations, they just start to fall apart almost immediately.
They really do. Because at the end of the day, these are societal constructs. They are mechanisms we use to simplify a wildly complex world.
So why do we do it? Why build the boxes in the first place?
Well, the sociological background here is crucial to understand before we even look at the refugees themselves. We actually have to look at the society reacting to them.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Following massive global shifts, like the 2007 financial crisis, there has been this lingering, deep-seated societal anxiety across Europe.
Which makes sense. People are stressed.
Very stressed.
Okay.
The sociologist Michael Hoffman refers to this as a desolidarization of society.
Okay, let's unpack that concept of desolidarization because, it sounds academic, but it feels very real. How does an economic crisis from way back in 2007 connect to how people view migration today?
It basically comes down to the psychology of resource guarding.
Resource guarding?
Yeah. When the middle class feels its own status is threatened, or when there is just a general simmering economic anxiety about inflation, housing markets, or job security welfare begins to be perceived as a zero-sum game.
Like if they get something, that means I lose something.
Precisely. The psychological mechanism here is that people process their own abstract fears by projecting them onto defined, visible outgroups.
So complex groups of human beings are reduced to extreme, easily digestible, and often negative images.
Exactly. It's a coping mechanism for the society itself.
So we create these two extreme boxes because they require zero cognitive load. It's just easier.
Unfortunately, yes.
On one side, the refugee as the calculated exploiter of the system, like dependent yet somehow also a threat to the community's resources.
Right.
And on the other side, the refugee as the helpless, passive victim who just needs to be saved. Which, strips them of any capability or threat, but also completely strips them of their autonomy.
That is a very accurate summary of the two poles.
What always strikes me about both of these narratives is what they actually share.
And what do you see them sharing?
They both completely erase the individual. I mean, they treat refugees as this faceless, historyless mass. The narrative is entirely about what society thinks of them rather than who they actually are.
Wow,
It's like
yes.
we are talking about a concept, not people who had whole lives before they crossed a border.
That is a very precise observation. And the frustrating thing is, it is not just a flaw in media or political rhetoric.
Oh.
No, it happens in scientific research as well. This is a really critical point. The political scientist J. Olaf Kleist has pointed out a glaring gap in migration and refugee research.
What's the gap?
The actual voices, the individual perspectives, and the distinct biographies of the refugees themselves are frequently just overlooked. We study them from the outside in.
So we apply our own metrics.
Exactly. We apply our Western metrics of vulnerability and precarity without ever asking them how they measure their own lives. We measure at them, not with them.
We measure at them. That's a great way to put it, which frankly brings us to the driving question of this entire discussion.
Right.
We have these two extreme boxes society has built. But what happens when we actually just ask the people inside those boxes what they think?
What a concept, right?
Exactly. How do they evaluate their own situations?
Well, to answer that, we are turning to a fascinating 2018 study by researcher Annika Jungmann.
Yes, this study is incredible.
It is titled Male, Educated and Precarious: Objective and Subjective Precarity of Syrian Refugees in Germany. Jungmann wanted to examine the lived realities of Syrian refugees in Leipzig, Germany.
But specifically how they see themselves, right?
Yes, she wanted to focus on how they evaluate their own lives.
And the way she went about this is just brilliant. When I was reading through the methodology, it struck me how carefully she selected her interview subjects.
It wasn't random at all.
Not at all. She didn't just interview a random sample of 50 people from all walks of life. She chose 4 specific men.
Let's call them person A, person B, person C, and person D.
Right. And all 4 are young, like between the ages of 21 and 35. All 4 are highly educated, meaning they had begun or completed university studies in Syria.
And there's more.
Yeah, they are all male, they're all from Syria, and they all arrived in Germany in the exact same time frame.
This specific demographic profile is highly intentional. By narrowing the focus to young, educated male Syrian refugees, Jungmann controls for a multitude of external variables.
It's so smart.
In qualitative science, this is how you get to the truth of an experience. I mean, they share the exact same biographical break, the onset of the Syrian conflict, and the resulting flight.
Right, they share that trauma.
Exactly. They are the exact same phase of life, and they are living in the same city.
It's basically a scientific analogy in action. By keeping the demographic profile identical, same age range, same education level, same origin, same exact timeline of arriving in Germany, the researcher essentially created a control group.
Yes, that is a great way to frame it.
It isolates the variables so we can see what's really going on beneath the surface. If their external circumstances are essentially identical, any differences in how they feel must stem from something much deeper than just being a refugee.
Precisely. And this leads us to the conceptual heart of this study.
Okay, let's get into it.
To understand their experiences, we have to look at the work of the British development sociologist Robert Chambers.
Robert Chambers. Got it.
Chambers developed a concept of vulnerability that splits into 2 crucial dimensions. And understanding this split is honestly the key to this entire deep dive.
I'm ready. What's the first dimension?
First, there is external vulnerability. These are the objective risks, the shocks, the measurable stress factors a person faces.
Like losing your home, facing a massive language barrier, or not having your degree recognized.
Exactly.
The things you can just put on a clipboard and check off.
Yes. But then Chambers introduces the second dimension, which is internal resilience.
Internal resilience.
This is how a person mentally and emotionally copes with those external factors. It encompasses their survival strategies, their mindset, their adaptability, their social networks.
So here is where it gets really interesting for me. Because of this split between external factors and internal coping, there is a massive fundamental difference between objective precarity and subjective precarity.
That is the decisive point.
It really is.
Objective precarity is the label society assigns based on measurable deficits. Like, do you have a job? Do you have a degree? Do you have money?
Right, the external stuff.
But subjective precarity is how the individual actually experiences and evaluates their own life based on their internal resilience.
Let's translate this mechanism for a second because I want to make sure we are crystal clear on how this works.
Sure, go for it.
It's like 2 people playing a video game on the absolute hardest difficulty setting.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Objectively, the software is identical, the enemies are the same, the game is punishingly difficult. But one player has a guidebook, a history of playing tough games, and friends cheering them on in the room.
That's their internal resilience.
Exactly. The other player is exhausted, has a controller with a broken button, and feels like the game is actively cheating them.
Right.
The external software is exactly the same, but the subjective experience of playing it is entirely different.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The mechanism of resilience dictates the experience of the hardship.
Makes total sense.
Now, let's look at the objective reality, the game software, to use your analogy of these four men in Leipzig. Externally, they are incredibly similar.
So what are they dealing with on paper?
They are all currently relying on the basic state welfare net in Germany, which is known as SGB II.
Okay, SGB2.
This means they receive a fixed, minimal monthly stipend for living expenses, and their basic rent is covered. But they're subject to strict rules and constant bureaucratic oversight from the job center.
Right, and just to add context for you listening, living on SGBT thing is objectively stressful.
Extremely.
Every cent is accounted for, and you are constantly required to prove you are looking for work or attending integration courses. It's not a free ride.
Far from it.
Yeah.
Furthermore, not a single one of these four men has had their Syrian academic degrees or study credits fully recognized in Germany.
Not one.
Not one. They all face massive, grinding, bureaucratic waiting times just to get a letter stating whether their past 5 years of university education mean anything.
That is so demoralizing.
And of course, they all carry the profound trauma of the Syrian conflict, the physical danger of their flight, and the loss of their homeland.
Right.
So objectively, by every single sociological metric, they are highly precarious.
On paper, they are the exact same person. They tick all the boxes for vulnerable and struggling.
Yes.
But then we look at the subjective reality and the lived view. When you actually listen to their interviews in the study, the monolithic narrative shatters completely.
He really does.
Despite these identical objective hurdles, their internal worlds couldn't be more different.
Let's contrast person C and person B, the two men you mentioned in your opening thought experiment.
Yeah, let's look at person C first.
Person C is 28 years old. He studied medicine in Syria and dentistry in Egypt before coming to Germany.
Highly educated.
Very. But his studies aren't recognized. He lives on SGB to a second state support, yet he explicitly states he's coping well.
Wait, really?
Yes, he feels free, he is optimistic, he is actively trying out new ideas. He even talks about working at a small, independent radio station.
That's a huge pivot from dentistry.
It is. And he even talks about eventually opening a restaurant or getting into local politics.
That is a staggering amount of optimism. Meanwhile, you have person B.
Right, let's look at him.
He is 31. He actually finished his degree in English translation and was working as an English teacher in Qatar before coming to Germany.
A full professional.
Exactly. Like person C, his degree isn't recognized and he relies on the state. But his subjective experience is the polar opposite.
How does he describe it?
He feels completely stuck. He describes his situation as purposeless, frustrating, and fundamentally hopeless. He says his degree feels like it is now worth zero.
That divergence in their work experiences perfectly illustrates how internal resilience and past context dictate the present.
How so?
Well, person A and B are furious with the German job market. Let's look at the mechanics of identity loss for person B. He was an English teacher.
Right.
In his mind, his skill is universal. English is a global language. He cannot understand why his real-world teaching experience in Qatar means absolutely nothing in Germany.
I have to admit, I was confused by that too when reading the sources. If he speaks and teaches English, why on earth wouldn't an English teaching degree from Qatar translate to Germany? I mean, English is English, right?
It is a perfectly logical question, but it really highlights the rigid nature of the German state pedagogical system.
Okay, break that down for me.
To teach in a German public school, it is not enough to simply know the language. You must pass two specific state examinations called the Staatsexamen.
The Staatsexamen.
Right, and you are generally required to study and teach two distinct subjects, not just one, like English and history, for example.
Oh, wow.
So the German bureaucracy simply does not have a mechanism to quickly map a single subject Qatari teaching degree onto its own highly formalized, dual subject, state-examined framework.
Yeah. So because the state's computer system essentially has no drop-down menu for his specific background, he is offered menial jobs that have absolutely nothing to do with his qualifications.
Exactly.
He's told to go pack boxes or clean floors, and that external shock, the unrecognized degree, and the massive demotion in social status has deeply wounded his internal sense of worth.
Yes.
His career was his identity.
Exactly. But then look at the psychological coping strategy of person C.
The optimistic one.
Right. Why is he so optimistic? It comes down to what psychologists call downward comparison.
Downward comparison.
Yeah. He doesn't compare his current situation to an idealized past in Syria before the war. He compares his life in Leipzig to the specific time he spent in Egypt during his flight.
What was he doing in Egypt?
In Egypt, he was working 16-hour days just to survive. He was exploited as an electrician, a cook, a bouncer.
Oh, wow. So for person C, yes, his medical degree isn't recognized in Germany either, but he got a low-paying gig at a small radio station.
Right.
And to him, compared to 16-hour days of hard labor where he had no legal rights, this feels like an incredible step up.
It is entirely about perspective.
He isn't focused on the lost medical degree. He is focused on the agency he has gained. He feels he can freely develop himself.
This completely reframes how we must think about precarity. Because if we apply pure logic to this situation, we have to ask a difficult question about the societal discourse.
I agree. What's the question?
The study's data suggests a stark misalignment. If rigorous qualitative science proves that reality is intensely complex and deeply individual, even among a demographic group that has been perfectly isolated for variables, why does public debate continually pretend that the refugees are a single, uniform mass?
Right. I mean, if they're all in the exact same objective situation, why on earth do they experience it so differently? And why does society refuse to see those differences?
To understand that blindness, we have to analytically examine the societal context that forces these men into boxes in the first place.
Okay, let's look at the societal context.
The study references the work of educational researcher Astrid Messerschmidt, who notes that Muslim men in Germany face a specific structural phenomenon known as triple discrimination.
Triple discrimination.
Yes, this is a layered prejudice based on three intersecting axes: sexism, classism, and racism.
Let's unpack that triple discrimination. I want to make sure we understand exactly what these men are walking into the moment they step out of their front door.
Certainly. Let's start with sexism.
Okay.
In this specific sociological context, sexism doesn't mean prejudice against women. It refers to the blanket societal assumption that Muslim men inherently hold traditionalist, patriarchal, and oppressive views on gender.
Oh, I see.
The moment they enter a room, there is often an implicit assumption that they are domineering or misogynistic,
Right.
simply based on their origin.
Oh, wait, I want to push back on the next point, the classism point.
Wait, what's your thought?
Is society actually assuming they are uneducated? Or is society just failing to map a Syrian university degree onto a German corporate structure, like we talked about with the English teacher? Because those feel like two very different types of prejudice.
How do you mean?
Well, one is active malice, like assuming they are less capable, and the other is just bureaucratic incompetence, like the computer not having the right drop-down menu.
That is a crucial distinction. It is actually a combination of both, which is why it is so damaging.
Okay, explain that.
On one level, yes, it is the bureaucratic failure to translate skills. But Messerschmidt argues that classism goes deeper. It is the broader societal assumption that individuals from these regions are fundamentally incompatible with a modern, high-skilled, knowledge-based economy. It is the subconscious viewing of Muslim refugee and German professional, as opposed to economic categories. Even if they hold a degree, their competence is immediately doubted in a way a migrant from, say, Canada would never experience.
That makes a lot of sense, sadly. The baseline assumption is a deficit of skill rather than an abundance of it.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the third layer is racism.
Yes. Racism here functions as the homogenization of incredibly diverse ethnic, national, and religious backgrounds into a single, often threatening racialized identity.
Right.
A Syrian doctor, an Afghan farmer, and an Iraqi mechanic are all flattened into this singular image of the Arab man.
And the study points out that this homogenization became incredibly pronounced after specific historical events in Germany, right? The timeline here is important.
Extremely important. Following the sexual assaults during the 2015-2016 New Year's Eve celebrations in Cologne, the media narrative underwent a massive shift. It heavily cemented the perpetrator role onto young male refugees from Muslim-majority countries. They became hyper-visible as potential threats in public spaces, but entirely invisible as individuals with complex lives, ambitions, and struggles.
So they are dealing with this every day.
Yes, they are subjected to everyday suspicion, racial profiling, and a generalized hostility that colors every interaction they have.
So, if we look at the whole board, not only are these four men dealing with the objective precarity of lost degrees, SGB through welfare constraints, and bureaucratic nightmares, they're also swimming in a societal soup of triple discrimination.
It is a heavy burden.
It really is. It makes the fact that they cope so differently even more fascinating. It proves that the problem of precarity isn't just about lacking a job or money.
Exactly. The core finding of Jungmann's study is that actual well-being, a person's internal resilience, is determined by an intricate web of factors.
A web of factors.
Yes, it's not just about income. The study meticulously breaks down 5 interconnected factors that dictate whether these men feel subjectively precarious or not.
Okay, let's walk through them.
We've already touched deeply upon the first one, which is work and education. We saw the immense frustration of unrecognized skills in person B versus the relief of escaping exploitation in person C.
So let's look at how the first factor bleeds into the second factor in this web, bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy is massive.
Because work and education are entirely gated by paperwork. We all know paperwork is annoying. But for a refugee, the bureaucracy is the gatekeeper to their entire physical existence.
Every single one of the 4 men expressed a deep hatred for the bureaucratic waiting times.
Understandably.
They felt the processes were arbitrary, senseless, and explicitly designed to stall their lives. Imagine waiting 18 months just for a letter telling you if you are allowed to enroll in a language class while your life is completely on hold.
That would drive anyone crazy.
But again, the objective hurdle is identical. The subjective coping, how they react to that design friction, is where the divergence happens.
Person D is a really striking example of this. He is 26 years old, and he studied law in Syria. He hates the waiting just as much as the others. But his psychological coping mechanism is action.
What does he do?
Instead of just sitting in his room staring at the wall, waiting for an official letter from the immigration office, he volunteers to help a Syrian family navigate their own bureaucratic appointments.
Oh, that's clever.
And he started teaching himself German from textbooks before he was even officially approved for a state-sponsored language course.
He creates his own agency where the state attempts to pause it.
Exactly.
By volunteering, he reclaims his identity as a competent, helpful individual, characteristics he likely valued as a law student. This contrasts sharply with those who feel entirely paralyzed by the same waiting period.
Now, the third factor in this web is deeply emotional, and I think it's one of the most invisible burdens they carry.
Which is?
Family and money. This is where the differences in their subjective precarity really starkly reveal themselves.
This part of the study highlights the hidden transnational lives of refugees.
Transnational lives.
Yes. When a young single man makes it to Europe, the expectation from back home isn't just, "We hope you are safe." It is often an immense, crushing financial responsibility.
Right. It's often, "We pulled the entire extended family's life savings to pay the smugglers to get you to Germany. You are our lifeline. You need to save us."
Precisely. The pressure of remittances. Person A and Person D feel an intense daily pressure to send money back to their families who are stuck in precarious situations in Egypt, Turkey, or Syria.
That's a huge weight.
It is a driving, deeply stressful motor for their every decision. In fact, this pressure is so severe that it dictates their educational choices. Both men explicitly chose to abandon their previous fields of study, business management and law, respectively.
That's a massive life pivot. I mean, why would a law student give up law?
Because retraining in German law would take years, perhaps a decade, before they could earn a substantial salary.
Oh, because of the immediate need for money.
Exactly. Instead, they are pivoting to pursue degrees in IT and social work in Germany, specifically because they have calculated that those fields will lead to faster employment.
Wow.
Their internal resilience is geared entirely toward rapid financial provision at the cost of their own original dreams.
It's a potent mix of survivor's guilt and financial responsibility. But then you look at Person C, the one who feels so free and optimistic, the one working at the radio station.
Yes, Person C.
Why is his internal resilience so much higher in this regard? Because his family is already in Leipzig. He and his brother managed to navigate the system and bring their parents over.
The psychological relief of that cannot be overstated.
It has to be huge.
He does not have the phantom weight of a family in a war zone resting on his shoulders every time he buys a coffee. He only has to take care of himself.
Right.
That absence of crushing familial responsibility gives him the psychological freedom to explore a low-paying radio job. He can afford to take risks because nobody will starve if he fails.
And then there is Person B, the English teacher, who feels hopeless.
His situation is very different.
His family is still in a village near Latakia, Syria. He doesn't necessarily feel the pressure to bring them to Germany because they are older and don't want to leave their home. But the physical separation causes him immense, paralyzing grief.
Right.
He just wants a normal life with his family around him, having dinner together.
Which brings us directly to the fourth factor in Young Man's Web: origin and Syria.
Okay, the fourth factor.
This factor encompasses the moral weight of the conflict itself. This isn't just about missing home or nostalgia. It's about the deep ethics of survival, complicity, and return.
The case of Person B here is tragic, and it illuminates the profound hidden burdens these men carry that absolutely no one on the street would ever guess. Let's walk through his timeline.
As a university graduate in Syria, you eventually have to face mandatory military service.
Right.
If you are working abroad, as Person B was in Qatar before the war really escalated, there is a legal mechanism in place. You can pay an exemption fee to the Syrian government to officially avoid the draft.
And just for context, this isn't a small administrative fee. We are usually talking about roughly $8,000 to $10,000 US dollars for Syrian expats.
It's a massive sum of money.
But when the war started, he faced an incredible moral dilemma.
Exactly. He realized that if he paid that massive exemption fee, he would be directly handing thousands of dollars to a government that was, in his own words, buying weapons against the people.
Wow.
He was watching his country tear itself apart, and he was being asked to fund it to buy his own freedom. So on pure moral principle, he refused to pay the fee.
But the consequence of that moral stand is absolute. By refusing to pay the fee and by refusing to return to serve in the military, he is considered a draft dodger by the state.
Yes.
There is likely an arrest warrant waiting for him at the border. He can now never, ever return to Syria.
He is permanently exiled from the family he desperately misses. The study notes that during the interview, he seemed to carry deep, visible regret.
I can't even imagine.
He made a highly principled, ethical choice not to fund a war, and it cost him his home forever. That is an invisible, subjective precarity that no welfare office form, no job center algorithm is ever going to capture.
Never.
When society looks at him and sees an unemployed migrant,
Yeah.
they are completely blind to the moral weight he is carrying.
Let's compare that to Person D, the former law student who volunteers. He also carries the weight of the conflict, but his internal resilience manages it differently.
How does he frame it?
He has made a firm internal vow. He will build a life in Germany. He will get his new degree in social work, but he states very clearly, he will only return to Syria when there is peace.
That's a powerful boundary.
He actually says in his interview, you can never be happy only in your homeland, believe me.
His exile is painful, but he views it as conditional. It is a temporary state, even if temporary means decades.
Right.
That mental framing allows him to function in the present without being paralyzed by grief.
It's all about the stories we tell ourselves to survive, the cognitive frameworks we build, which leads us to the fifth and final factor in this complex web, culture and expectations.
This one is huge.
This is the collision between what your home society expects of you, what your host society expects of you, and what you actually want for yourself.
The study categorizes this as the tension between perceived Syrian sets and German sets of norms.
Okay, Syrian sets and German sets.
Now, it is important to note that these aren't monolithic. There are many ways to be Syrian and many ways to be German, but they represent the perceived cultural standards the men feel they are navigating.
Person B is really struggling here as well. He is holding rigidly onto the Syrian set of expectations regarding masculinity and success.
Right.
In his mind, to be a successful, respectable man, you must have a solid career, you must be a provider, and you must be married by the time you're 30. All 8 of his siblings back in Syria are married with children.
And he is 31. He is unemployed, he is unmarried. In his own eyes, measured against the standard he simply refuses to let go of, he is a fundamental failure.
It is heartbreaking.
He feels he cannot even discuss these cultural differences or his struggles with his family back home. He says in his interview, maybe the Germans find it okay to get 1,000 or 1,500 euros, but for us life is different. At 30 years old, you have to be married.
He is trapped by an ideal he cannot currently reach, which drastically heightens his subjective precarity. He is applying a ruler to his life that ensures he always measures up short.
But then you have persons C and D. They are selectively adopting what they perceive as German sets of norms, and it is actively liberating them.
How so?
They talk about the freedom to have platonic friendships with women or to have a girlfriend without the immediate crushing expectation of marriage and financial provision.
Crucially, their internal resilience allows them to communicate this shift to their families without fear. Person D explains to his family back home that life in Germany is different, that the timeline for adulthood is stretched out here, that he wants to remain single for now while he studies, and his family accepts it.
That makes all the difference.
Person C feels entirely embraced by the Western cultural norms. He feels he can finally express his individuality without communal judgment.
So when we synthesize this entire web, the loss of professional identity, the intentional friction of bureaucracy, the pressure of remittances, the moral trauma of the war and exile, and the heavy burden of cultural expectations, we see that the problem of precarity is emphatically not just about lacking a job.
Not at all.
The objective poverty is almost the least of it.
It's the collision of all these forces at once. It is the intersection of bureaucratic walls, survivor's guilt, family expectations, and the societal prejudice they face when they walk out the front door.
And that societal prejudice brings us to a critical, escalating question we must ask ourselves about the environment we create.
Let's hear it.
Because when society refuses to see the individual, when it relies on triple discrimination and extreme narratives, it inflicts a very specific kind of psychological harm.
What kind of harm?
The study references educational scientist Paul Mascherel's concept of precarious belonging.
What exactly does precarious belonging mean in a practical sense?
It is the internalized feeling that no matter what you do, no matter how perfectly you learn the language, no matter what official papers you eventually hold, you are fundamentally viewed as an outsider.
Wow.
You are perpetually othered simply because you are not perceived as part of the dominant normative majority. Your membership in the society is always conditional, always precarious.
The study gives a really heartbreaking concrete example of this. Person A, the 23-year-old who abandoned business to study IT so he could send money home.
Right, what happened to him?
He talks about experiencing explicit racism at a former workplace in Germany. Colleagues intentionally ignoring him, management treating him unjustly compared to German coworkers. He said the experience made him feel like a man with no dignity.
When a person's dignity is actively stripped away by the very society they are desperately trying to integrate into, their internal resilience is severely attacked.
Absolutely.
It is incredibly difficult to maintain optimism or agency when the environment constantly signals that you are unwanted.
This raises the ultimate question of this deep dive. We've seen that these four men with identical objective circumstances cope in wildly different ways. Person C thrives, person B despairs.
Yes.
But if people cope so differently despite facing the exact same objective hurdles, does the problem of precarity lie solely within them?
It is a vital question. Is it just a matter of telling person B he needs to be more optimistic, or telling person A he needs to develop thicker skin?
Or does the problem also lie heavily in how they are spoken about, perceived, and institutionally treated by the society around them?
Right.
The objective hurdles the fact that a Qatari teaching degree isn't recognized, the agonizing 18-month bureaucratic delays. Those are structural societal choices. The triple discrimination of sexism, classism, and racism is a societal behavior.
The study's data suggests a stark misalignment. Society measures these men by their ability to run a rigorous obstacle course of integration, while simultaneously erecting bureaucratic and societal barriers that effectively blindfold them.
That's a great analogy.
We demand resilience, but often foster environments that actively erode it.
It demands that we shift our analytical lens. We have spent an hour scrutinizing the internal lives of these four refugees, but the real takeaway is that we need to start scrutinizing the society that structures their reality.
Precisely. When we constantly reduce human beings to a single role, whether we cast them as the helpless victim to be pitied or the calculated burden to be resented, we lose all analytical clarity.
We just don't see them.
Do we even see what is actually happening in front of us anymore? Or do we only see exactly what we want to see to make ourselves feel secure?
It is a profound question that requires us to look past our own cognitive shortcuts, our own anxieties, and acknowledge the deeply complex, sometimes uncomfortable reality of human lives.
And acknowledging that complexity is the only way to move from managing a perceived crisis to actually understanding the human beings involved in it.
That was an episode of EmpowerMigra. EmpowerMigra understanding begins with listening.